Well, as we enter into our text this morning, I'm coming in here just to, my voice is a little hoarse. I was at a week of camp. I was up at Mount Herman, camp in Santa Cruz, teaching for the week, which was so much fun. And so might be a little delirious this morning. You never fully know what's going to come out, right? As it was a tiring week. But no, so excited to just be in this place as we get to dive into the Word of God together and journey into it. I truly believe that God has some truths for us this morning to encourage us, as we're talking about what does it mean to have this foundation of hope and what God is doing. What God is doing here at Calvary, what God is doing in our own lives, of stepping forward into that hope. Like I said, I was up at camp, and it was with a bunch of middle schoolers this week, and so I teach in the evenings, and then they have their small groups and they discuss, and every once in a while I get to sit on these middle school age small groups, and it was great just to sit. I think you learn so much from middle schoolers in the room, high schoolers in the room. There's just so much that you guys teach us. And I was sitting there, and we were kind of having a time of just open questions. And one of these, he was like a 12-year-old boy, he looks and he says, "What is the purpose of church?" Like, my parents make me go every Sunday, but what is the point of it? I said, well, it's a great question. I think a lot of us should probably ask that question. And I kind of looked at the group and I said, well, what do you guys think? And as is typical of a middle school boys small group, maybe any small group, there's that moment of silence, and everyone just kind of is awkwardly waiting for someone to say something, and I'm great with the awkward silence, so I'm just staring at them in silence for a bit. And eventually one of the other students says, well, I think the point of church is to become more like Jesus so that my friends can know God loves them too. Sermon done, right? He said, I think the point of church is to become more like Jesus so that my friends can know that Jesus loves them too. I think sometimes we overcomplicate the message of the gospel. It's so simple. It's to become like Jesus so that the people around us can also know who Jesus is. If you guys have been with us, we've been going through this series, and we've been going through the book of Ezra and Nehemiah, and last week we read Nehemiah chapter 1. And just a little recap of this, right? We talked about how the temple was rebuilt. And it took years, 20 years, and eventually the temple was rebuilt, and the people get to come back out of exile, and they get to worship again for the first time in 70 years. And how the temple represented the very presence of God in the people. And last week we got to the book of Nehemiah. Nehemiah is serving in the courts of the king in the Persian Empire. And it says he gets a report of the people back in Jerusalem, in the city of God, and worshiping. And it says that his heart breaks because, yes, the presence of God in the temple is restored, but the walls around the city are in ruin. And we talk about why is it that Nehemiah is weeping over this? Why is he so distraught and so disturbed by the fact that the walls of the city are in ruins? And we said it's because when God created us, it's because he created us for presence, but he also created us for purpose. And Nehemiah realized that because the temple walls were destroyed and the walls around the city were destroyed, that they couldn't fully live into their purpose as the people of God. So someone asked Nehemiah, what is the point of the city? He says, so I can be in the presence of God, but so that I can also live out the purpose of God, so my friends know that God loves them too. And that's where we enter the story this morning. And I want us to think about is, we think, well, what even is the purpose of church? What is the purpose of following God in our own lives? Well, then I think we have to follow, then how do we get there? If the purpose is to live in presence of God, but also live with purpose for God, how do we take that step and begin to grow in our purpose? To practically live out what it looks like to love God and to love people. To be a disciple who is making disciples. To be in presence, but also in purpose with God. And so Nehemiah chapter 2. Nehemiah has gotten this news, and the very opening line, we mentioned this last week. It says, during the month of Nisan, the 20th year of King Artaxerxes. As we started in chapter 1, if you weren't here last week, we saw the story started in the month of Kislev. And the month of Kislev was in November or December, and now we're in the month of Nisan, which is probably the month of March or April, kind of in the Greek rendering of the calendar here. And so it's been 5 months since we left Nehemiah last week. 5 months after his heart is broken and he's weeping over the state of Jerusalem and the city walls being broken and burned down. It says, in the month of Nisan, the 20th year of King Artaxerxes, when I sat before the king and I took the wine and I gave it to him, because remember, Nehemiah is the cupbearer of the king, and his job is to the right hand of the king and to taste the food, to make sure that he's safe, and he's sitting there, and it's easy just to jump past this verse. But I think there's something really beautiful here. If we're talking about what is our purpose and how do we live into that purpose, I think the first thing that we see is there's hope in waiting. There's hope in waiting. It's been 5 months since Nehemiah's heart has been burdened of this truth, and he's been weeping, and he's been crying out to God over this, and he's been waiting, and he's been waiting, and he's been waiting. For 5 months he has this burden and doesn't know what to do with it, and yet it says that Nehemiah is waiting in this place. And as we're talking about how do we live into our purpose, I think we have to ask the question of how do we find hope in the seasons of waiting? If you read Scripture, this is kind of the program that's laid out throughout. It's kind of the formula that you see throughout the pages here of people who are called by God, and before they can step into that, there's a season of waiting. And so no surprise, if God is calling us to do something, oftentimes it's going to be met, it's going to be preceded by a season of waiting. Right? You look at Abraham, and God said, I'm going to make you a great nation. Well, after God told him this, it was 25 years till this even came to pass. His wife was 90 years old who was barren and couldn't have kids, and eventually she's able to have a child at 90. It was met with waiting. This promise was met with a season of waiting. You look at Joseph, and Joseph, who was this man who had dreams and was going to help establish and save the world as there was an immense famine, and God had promised him. It was 13 years before Joseph saw these promises come to fruition, and the promise was met with a season of waiting before that came to pass. You look at Moses, he spends 40 years in the wilderness before he even goes to rescue the nation of Israel out of slavery, and before they spend another 40 years waiting to enter the promised land that God has given him. You look at David as a teenager, he was promised he was going to be king, and it wasn't for 13 years until he finally becomes king. You look at Elizabeth, we don't talk about Elizabeth much, right? She's the mother of John the Baptist, and John the Baptist came to prepare the way of the Lord, to be the last prophet that said the kingdom is coming here on earth, and Jesus is the king of the kingdom. And it says that she also couldn't have kids, and she's waiting in the season, and she's 60 or 70, and this miracle happens, and there's waiting is met before the plans of God are enacted. Jesus waits for 30 years before his ministry is coming. In the New Testament, Paul, the massive church planner who helps grow and start the church, it says that after he has his conversion in the book of Galatians chapter 2, it says for 3 years he waited and prepared for what God was doing. Hope in waiting. And so as we're maybe asking God, what are you doing in my life and how to live about this purpose, I want to remind us that it's okay to maybe be in a season of waiting. That in this season of waiting, God is actually doing a greater work in our hearts to prepare us for the work that he wants to do. And Nehemiah isn't just twiddling his thumbs and waiting for 5 months, but I think we get some glimpses in the text here that he is laboring in prayer. He's not being passive in waiting, he's being active by coming before the feet of God in prayer. And I love that Nehemiah, I can imagine, is praying for this miracle, right? This act of God to restore the temple walls and to restore the walls around the city. And yet I think what's even deeper than that, though, is Nehemiah is praying for God's hand, but he's also praying for God's opportunity. I think so often in our own lives, we can say, God, I want you to do this big thing and send someone else to do it. I want my friend to know about you, and so will they just encounter you? And instead of sometimes saying, God, I want my friend to know about you, and provide an opportunity for me to live into that purpose that you have invited me into. And I think Nehemiah is praying with opportunity. Saying, God, how can you use me to fulfill what you are calling me to in this season? And there's hope in waiting as he kneels before the Lord and is waiting for what God is doing. And so as we're looking for a purpose, the first thing I want to invite us into is say, what may God be calling us to sit and wait with him for? That maybe instead of waiting for that phone call where God's going to take us next, And being so forward-thinking, saying, God, if only I was at that next place, maybe we're missing what God is doing in this current season as we just get to sit with God and be with God and wait with God. The second thing I think we see is there's hope in waiting, but there's also hope in preparing. There's hope in the preparation, and Nehemiah doesn't just sit here and do nothing, but he begins to formulate, God, what made this opportunity look like, and how can I step into that opportunity when it arises? And so the very next verse, right, as Nehemiah is serving wine to the king, and he's sitting in the presence of the king, and it says, the king said to me, in verse 2, he says, why do you look so sad when you aren't sick? Why do you look so sad, Nehemiah, when you aren't sick? And it must be something deeper. It must be something internal. It must be something in your heart that is bothering you. One shout out to Artaxerxes for having some emotional intelligence here, right? I think we can learn from that. I was saying it's not just something on the surface. You're not just sick. There's something deeper going on here. Context here, right? Back in the day, if you were a cupbearer of the king, especially in the Persian Empire, you don't show up sad to work. It's one of those things where it's literally in your job description to be happy and to be positive and to be supporting the king. And so if you show up sad in that culture as you're the cupbearer of the king, best case scenario, you lose your job that day. Worst case scenario, you lose your life. Like that's the severity of this culture and this context and what it meant to be the cupbearer and the responsibility that was. And so Nehemiah, for 5 months, his heart is burdened with this, and yet he allows those emotions to drive him forward, but he doesn't allow those emotions to derail his life in this moment. He says, God, I'm not just going to push those emotions below the surface that I feel we talked about last week, but I'm going to wait and allow those to push me when the right opportunity arises. And the right opportunity arises, and it says that King Artaxerxes sees that he is sad. And I can imagine Nehemiah's heart pounding as he doesn't know what the response is going to be. Am I going to lose my life? Am I going to lose my job? The next line. It says, with great fear, I came before the king. With great fear. And so Nehemiah's heart is trembling here. And the king asks, what is it that you want? I see that you are sad. What is it that you request of me? Here's a blank check. Nehemiah, what do you want? Now, this doesn't happen back in the day. The king doesn't often ask the cupbearer, hey, if I can do anything for you, what do you want me to do for you? Right? We see that there's hope in waiting, but there's hope in preparation. And I think we see that because for the last 5 months, Nehemiah has faithfully been serving the king. He's faithfully, probably for longer than has been serving the course of the king, and he's built this relational equity so when the time comes, when the opportunity presents itself, he's ready to step into this moment here. I think we see in this that sometimes, again, we're so ready to get out of this season, and what would it look to actually be faithful in the little moments when nobody is watching? Because in Nehemiah's faithfulness, when nobody was watching, he was able to build this equity with the king and this relational trust with the king, so that when the king saw that he was sad, he didn't put him to death, but he said, what can I do for you instead? He's building up in these moments this sense of preparation, saying, but I'm still going to be faithful to where I'm at, even though I don't know when that opportunity is going to present itself. And he's living with hope in the preparation of this moment. And he has courage to then come before the king. I think sometimes we think courage is the absence of fear. But courage isn't the absence of fear. Courage is acting even amidst the fear. Courage is acting even when that fear is present. And it says that Nehemiah is coming with great fear. And yet in verse 4 it says, but I prayed to the God of heaven and answered the king's question. He says, if it pleases the king, if your servant has found favor with you, then send me to Judah, to the city where my ancestors are buried, so that I may rebuild it. And I think we see here that yes, Nehemiah has been waiting, and yes, that he's been laboring with the Lord, but Nehemiah is also prepared for when that opportunity presents itself. And the first thing we see in this, right, is when that question is asked of him, he has a response ready. Maybe we've been praying for the things of God for a long time, but when that happens, are we going to be ready to actually receive that good work? Nehemiah is ready because he's been hoping in preparation. And he begins to lay out this now plan for the king. He lays out this plan for the king. He says, "King, if it pleases you, let me go back and rebuild the city." And the king asks another question. He says, "Well, how long are you going to be gone, Nehemiah? Because if you're not checking my wine every day, I might die. Like, I need to know these things," right? He says, "How long are you going to be gone for?" And it says that Nehemiah gives him a direct response. In the text, it doesn't say how long, but it says he answers his question directly. Well, we find out later that it's actually 12 years that Nehemiah is gone. And so this isn't just for saying, "Hey, boss, like I want 2 weeks off of vacation." This is basically Nehemiah saying, "Here's my letter of resignation. Please don't kill me, and please don't fire me, but can I go?" And yet, because Nehemiah has built favor with the king's like, "Yeah, you can go." And it says this request pleased the king. But the conversation doesn't stop there, and this would have been enough. It would have been more than enough for Nehemiah to even present himself as being sad in the king's presence. It would have been even more than enough for him to say, "Can I have this in absence?" But he takes it one step further. He has courage one step longer, and he says, "But king, I also have a request of you." And right after this, he asked for the king. He said, "I also said," verse 7, "to the king, if it pleases the king, let me have letters written to the governors of the surrounding areas that will grant me safe passage until I reach Judah." Right? Step 1 of the plan was, "Can I have a leave of absence?" Step 2 of the plan is, "Hey, can you help provide protection and safe passage for me so that I can actually get to where I'm going safely?" Part 3 of the plan says, "And also, can you write me a letter to Asaph, the keeper of the king's forest, so that he will give me timber to rebuild the gates of the temple fortress and the city wall and the home where I am to live." So he asks to be able to release and to be able to go. He asked for protection, but now he asks for vision. For the city walls, for the gates, and notice this, for my house too. For a place that I can live and I can dwell. And there's a part of me that thinks, "Wait, well done, Nehemiah. Like, you can't afford this mission, and now you just got a house out of the deal too? Like, come on." Like, that's some courage there, right? And then from there, he talks to the king and says, "And I want to recruit the people of Jerusalem to rebuild this wall." I have 2 older brothers. My oldest brother, they're both very different. My oldest brother is an engineer. And he loves a plan. Right? He won't start anything and maybe anything right without a good plan. Right? I need that 5-step plan of what am I doing next. He is that person that you read every single instruction. My other brother, he's a musician. And he's a jazz musician, so he hates structure and order. He's all about the improvisation. After college, I got to live with each of them for a year, and I always forget I learned how to cook from both of them. I lived with my oldest brother, the engineer, my first year, and it was the meat has to be exactly 125 degrees, and we're going to make sure we're washing the whole time. We're going to follow every direction. Whereas my other brother, the jazz musician, was like, "I'll just throw this ingredient in the pan and stir it around and see what happens," right? And this weird combination of both in the middle. I think sometimes when it comes to following God, it can be easy to say, do I really need a plan? Like, God's just going to provide, and I'm going to live into that. And that's true. God's provision is there. And yet I think sometimes on the other side, saying, I need to do every single thing written to the T and check off every box to get there. And I think there's this balance in the middle. I think there's this invitation for someone to say, "I'm waiting, God, I need you to show up. And maybe I don't know exactly what that's going to look like, but I trust you in that." But then I also think for some of us, we need to say, "But I also need to have a plan for when that happens so that I can enact what God is calling me into in this place." To have hope in waiting in the unknown, but to have hope in preparation as we step into what God is calling us to. And so Nehemiah enacts this plan and asks the king to do it. And it says the king blesses it and he sends him on his way. I got a map up here. We'll throw it up on the screen. I put this up last week just again for context. Nehemiah is in the capital city of Susa, right? And you can see that's kind of off there on that far right-hand side of the screen. And he has to travel all the way to Jerusalem. This would have taken multiple days, and yet it says that as he's getting ready to go and embark on this mission, he's made his plan. He's asked for preparation. He's asked for preparation. He's asked for the ability to travel here safely. And he can do this because he's discerned what is it that God is calling me into. And then he gets there. And so there's hope in waiting, there's hope in preparing, and now there's hope in acting out that plan. It says as he gets there and he arrives all worn out and tired, it says, for the next 3 days I didn't do anything, but I just sat there. And after 3 days, it says he gets up and he goes with some men, a few people from Jerusalem. And it says he goes out in the middle of the night and begins to inspect the walls of the city. And at night he sneaks out because he's worried about the people and the warring nations around him. And he journeys around this wall to see what is the damage, what is the destruction, what are the cracks that are actually mending. And he begins to now enact his plan that God has given him, that God has been stirring in his heart this whole time, and to live into that. What does this look like to live into this plan now, God? And I think we see something really beautiful. And so that as he's enacting this plan, it says he takes time to stop and to survey what is around him, to examine the broken ruins, to allow his plan to maybe shift a little bit of saying, but now that I'm actually here, maybe I think you're moving in this way, God, and I actually got to put more energy and more effort over here on this southern portion of the wall, and it begins to examine what is broken. Hope in waiting, hope in preparation, but hope in acting, and I think that begins with saying, maybe in our own lives, we need to begin examining what is the work, God, that you are actually calling me into. What are those areas that are broken that I need to address? And as he's examining the walls, it says he hasn't told anybody. It doesn't tell us how long this examining process takes, but eventually in verse 18 it says, after examining the walls, he calls all the people back together. And as they're sitting there, and he's now about to present his vision of how do we move forward in action. He says, I said to the people who were gathered before me, you see the trouble we are in. Jerusalem lies in ruins and its gates have been burned. Come, let us rebuild Jerusalem's walls so that we may no longer be a disgrace. And I told him how the gracious hand of God was on me and gave me favor with the king. And so now he gathers the people together, and now it's the hope to act what God has called the people into, what God has called Nehemiah into. And it's that invitation into this call of God and into this vision of saying this is how we step into what is next. And I love this because his vision is tied to his original calling. His vision of how to move forward is almost word for word the very exact thing that broke his heart 5 months earlier when we read he heard about the walls being broken. I think for some of us, we're saying, God, what is my purpose and how do I live into this? I think we need to remember that the vision of where we're going is often very similar to the calling that God has laid on our heart. It's very similar to that burden that we feel internally inside of us that God is saying, I want you to lean into this and to move in this area, to not only learn about me, become me, but to help other people become like me. To live in presence, but to also live in purpose of what God has called us to. And so it says he gives this vision to the people. Let us rebuild the walls so we're not living in shame. And then this last line, I want to end us with this. The people said, let us start rebuilding. And their hands were strengthened to do the good work. Let us rebuild the walls. It says their hands were strengthened to do this good work. Strengthened, this word here is this word that's in an incomplete tense. It means that it's something that is happening in the present, but it's also coming to fruition in the future as well. It's not this one and done, I've strengthened my hands, I'm good to go. No, it's this continual process of saying I need to over and over and over and over again continue to strengthen my hands for the work that God has set before me. I wonder what it would look like to have strengthened hands as we set out to do this work that God has called us into. My dad growing up, he was a bike mechanic for several years, and his hands were very strong. We always played this game as a kid. I'd always try to squeeze my dad's hand and see if I could make him break first, right? If I could make him let go of that grip, and I could never do it. And my dad, right, being gracious, wouldn't squeeze his hardest because obviously my little kid hand probably would not be a little kid hand anymore. And yet every single time I come home, I still do that. I grab my dad's hand and we just don't let go for a while. And I see if I can beat him still. And I still can't do it. But it's because my dad had put in the work to strengthen his hands. Day in and day out, that's what his job was working with his hands. And so over time, those muscles in his hand got stronger and got stronger and got stronger. And even still, he's still often out doing things with his hands and working in the yard. And when I go home to squeeze his grip, I can never beat it because his hands are strengthened. Because it's a continual process of living into that strengthening. And I think for us as a church, I think for us as individuals, say, God, how do I live into my purpose? I think there's this call in the middle of that to say, one, we need to say yes to what God is calling us to. But we need to put in the reps to actually have the strength to fulfill what God is calling us to. Yes, we need to say yes to what God is calling us to, but we need to have the strength and the endurance to step into what God is calling us to. And so as we wrap this up, we say, God, like, what does it look like to live into this purpose that you have called us for and you have called us into? I think we need to say, well, God, how do we strengthen our hands then? How do we put in the work to continuously be ready so that when God does open that opportunity, we're ready to step into what God has called us to? And to do that, I think Nehemiah just gave us the perfect scripts to know how to strengthen our hands. It's hope in waiting. It's recognizing that sometimes in these seasons, as we're allowing ourselves to be strengthened, that God has us in this season of waiting for a reason. What does it look like to be proactive in seasons of waiting and say, God, what are you doing as I'm waiting in the season? And how do I come before you in prayer and waiting with purpose? So we strengthen our hands from having hope in the seasons of waiting. We strengthen our hands through the repetition of us saying, and when that opportunity presents itself, how do I have hope to step into that? And how do I enact what God is calling me to? And how do I have courage? And that courage comes from being prepared for that thing that God is calling us into. How are we proactively making a plan and saying, God, like, this is what it looks like for me to intentionally be spending time with you. God, this is what it looks like to pray for my friend's salvation and be ready for an answer when they actually ask me, who is this God that you serve? It means being ready when my coworker has been working alongside me and finally they have this huge life crisis happen and they're ready to talk because you put in the time and the years to just build that friendship over and over and over again. We strengthen our hands by having hope and being proactive and waiting, but also being proactive and preparing ourselves for the work that God wants to do. And the last thing we do is we strengthen our hands by actually doing the work God has called us to. And so the question is, are we putting in the reps now to have the strength to do what God is calling us to do? You know, whatever season you find yourself in of waiting or beginning to act out what God is calling and placing in your heart. Are you ready to actually step into that gift God has given you and that purpose He has called you to? As a church, that invitation is here as well. What does it look like for us to lean into this season of preparation that I believe God has a good work for us to do? As we're in the midst of transition, and we've talked about this relentlessly all summer, that our focus, and it's sitting on your seat right now, we made a little card so that you can remember it. Right on this bookmark here, I got one in my Bible somewhere, where it has our summer focus, and we're just saying, like, this is what we're focusing on. Of actively, in unity, seeking the Lord, of waiting with the Lord intentionally. So we can experience hope in the new work that God is doing. Right? And it's that invitation to say, like, as a church community, like, how do we lean into this together and say, God, like, this is where you're going, this is where you're moving, and this is where I put my hope as I'm leaning and I'm looking to your leading and your direction in my life. And so we strengthen our hands by waiting in hope and preparing in hope and acting in hope. And here's the final thread, and I'm going to have the band coming up as we wrap up. Well, what is that hope, though? See, for Nehemiah, that hope and how he could wait and how he could prepare and how he can act wasn't circumstantial. That hope and that foundation wasn't, God, if you do this, then I know that I can move forward and then I'll have hope and you're good. It isn't hope in Artaxerxes the king giving him favor and allowing him to have preservation and preparation for the journey. It isn't even in hope that when he gets here, the people are going to listen to him and trust this vision of what he's calling them into and this burden God has given them. It isn't even hope that one day these walls will be rebuilt around the city. So then what is that hope that he's waiting and he's preparing and he's acting on? And again, we get a clue in the text here. In verse 8, after he comes before the king, it says in verse 8, it says, and God's hand was upon me to give me favor before the king. See, that hope was God's presence and his hand on Nehemiah as he was in the season of waiting. Later on in verse 12, when Nehemiah finally gets there and he's surveying the walls, in verse 12 it says, and God had burdened my heart to do this work. So that God had placed and laid on my heart this good work to do. And so in this season of preparation as he's surveying, God's presence is there, and there's hope in God's presence. And at the very end, when he's coming to enact his plan, and he's inviting the people into this plan, he says, let us do this work. For God's hand has been upon me and has given me favor with the king. Again, God's reminder of his presence. I said, if God was with me before, then he's going to be with me where we're going. And that's what this invitation to hope is. That hoping while waiting is waiting in the presence of God. That hoping in preparation is preparing with the burden of God on us. Then hoping in action is acting with the reminder that God has been with us and will continue to be with us. See, the thread through all of this is the hope, is the foundation of hope at the very bottom of this, that God is present and God is active and God is inviting me into this work that he is doing. And in this invitation that he's not alone in that. And so hope isn't circumstantial, hope is presence focused. And so in our own lives, as we are maybe in a season of waiting, maybe we're in a season of that bridging the gap and saying, but how do I step into maybe what is next? Maybe it's a season of actually acting and beginning to do these things that God is calling you to do. The thread through all of that is God's presence and hope that says, my hand is on you. That burden is on your heart because I am with you. And that promise goes before you as you lean into my hope and my truth. To fulfill the purpose that I have called you into. And so as we wrap up the sermon, that in some ways has become very to-do oriented. To check the box and say, well, I need to wait and hope, I need to prepare, and I need to actually have my plan. I don't have a plan. How am I going to go do that? And, oh, maybe I'm supposed to be acting like, God, like, how do I do these things? To check the box, to do. And yet I think the invitation here is not into doing things for God, but to entering in with God. To what he's already done. To be a part of God's kingdom work here on earth. We're going to close with this song, and it talks about hope on the horizon. Looking towards that hope, and for some of us, gosh, that hope seems so distant and so far away. And it's God, I've been waiting here, and gosh, that's the one that resonates with me right now. Like, how do I experience your hope, Jesus? How do we make that plan to step forward to what you've called me to, Jesus? And it's centered in this place of saying, God, the invitation is I get to be a part of what you're doing here on this earth. I get to be in your presence, and I get to be a part of your purpose. what is the point of church? I think it's to become like Jesus, so that our friends can know that he loves them too. And we get to do that by living in this place of hope. As we wait with God, as we prepare with God, and as we act in the ways that God has called us to.